Hello, welcome to Philosophy Roulette, number 173, where we read and review live philosophy papers for you, the viewing public, on the internets. This week, because Black Lives Matter, and it's America, and it just seems like the thing to do. We're doing philosophy of race, if I can click, that is. I was just watching before, right now actually, I only got through half of it. Dave Chappelle has a little special about I think it's about a half hour long on the sort of current situation. It was interesting. He said, people keep asking on him, like, why haven't you said something? And, I mean, yeah, there's reasons why he's been mostly hadn't put a statement out, but he said he figured out why people were asking for his opinion. Because I mean, it's like he says, look, celebrity opinions, who really cares at this point? It's like that doesn't really, it's sort of beside the point to get the celebrity opinion on what's going on. He said, but why are they asking for his opinion so hard? He said, because, I don't lie to you. He says, institutions, they've lied to you, but he says, I don't lie to you. So that's always an interesting thing, and at least in terms of, we've been reading some papers from on aesthetics and comedy, and we've also read recently papers on fictionalism and literature. So there's the question of what counts as a lie. Like, if you tell a novel is not a lie in some sense. Wait, did I just see a Louvel? Because I know there's a guy, Louvel Anderson. Did I just blank out on that? How did I get that in my head? But I mean, because he does, I think, comedy too. I was just saying, let's see if I can find that. Louvel? Yeah, there it is. Race and Biology. Oh, so he was an editor. That's what it was. He's not no other Louvel Anderson. But he's saying, so there's a question of fictionalism, what it is to lie in a when you're not like in a sort of a truth mode. I mean, comedy, you tell jokes. They don't all have to have happened exactly what they don't have to have existed for it to be a joke. So the question is, what is the status of truth in when you're not truth in aesthetics and things like that, and literature and comedy for that matter. Especially in comedy, it seems like there was a comedian. Someone goes, "Oh," after their joke, they go, "Oh, that never really happened," and the guy stops and goes, "No. Of course not. That was a joke. That's what I'm here doing. I'm telling jokes. They don't all have to happen. Like, it doesn't have to be real. Do you think every joke a comedian tells is actually happens? Of course not. But that's what made it all the more interesting when Dave Chappelle said, I don't lie to you. So it's like, when he's joking, when he's not. That also has a thing about the recent paper we read on Yellowface, actually, on white actors pretending to be Chinese, or Japanese for that matter. So they were saying it's like you're in on the joke. It's not real at that point. And so the difference between what is this? Viewing the Black Panther movie through lenses of liberation philosophy and liberation theology. Interesting. All right. So that's an interesting question here. All right. Synthesis. Hey, Rich Mazy 504. Rich Mazy, what is up? White supremacy in Eurowestern Epistemologies. All right, we'll take a look quick. Placebo effect and racial and ethnic health disparities. Biomedical ethics. All right, let's take a look at that. How to think the world. Achilles Mbebe on race, democracy, and the African role in global thought. Looks like a review. Agnostic racial politics and racism strategies. I don't know. Radical philosophy review. Let's take a look. Might be agonistic. Or might be. Yeah, I don't have I don't put links in the chat, JD. So careful there. I don't do song reviews. I do philosophy reviews, and frankly, you probably wouldn't want my opinion anyway. I'm not actually very. I wouldn't know what even to say. So this is not really what I do here. And secondly, I couldn't even give you a good opinion. So, I mean, You can send it over. I will take a listen, but like I'm not going to do it on air because that's not what I do. But yeah, I'll take a listen. I'll send you like an email back if you really want. I read philosophy papers and comment on them. Basically, is what going on here. Don't be ignorant. It's always a good that's a good title. All right, so let's see what we got. Black Panther movie. I always like movies that I've seen because I've seen that movie, but I can't get it, so I'll click on it. Maybe I'll get lucky. Oh, it's a review. Wait, is this by the director? Oh, cool. But anyway, I don't have access to it, so not getting read. Alright, we got this. Let's see. Synthesis Philosophica Euro. Let's see. Ingleski. Well, let's take a look. Save file. Maybe I'll check it in a second. So, you know what? Just click that quick. See what it looks like. 13 pages. All right, that's a possibility. Placebo effect. All right, so this is biomedical ethics. Let's see if it's available. Radical philosophy review. Not available. Too bad. Don't be ignorant. It's a good title. Let's see if it. I'm going to be ignorant of being ignorant. Unfortunately, I'm going to be ignorant of being ignorant. Because I can't get this paper. That is too bad. Alright, so I guess we're going to be doing the Synthesis Philosophica from... Alright, so let's take a look at this one. What did I do? Yeah. Sorry. I was all thinking about Dave Chappelle. I didn't get completely set up. It's amazing. It only takes a few seconds for me to get set up. I've kind of got it down to a science at this point, but... Oh no, what is that? Okay, it worked. Got scared for a second there. It was blank screen. It's like, what the heck? Okay, so white supremacy and Eurocentric epistemologies on the West's responsibility for its philosophical heritage. Alright, so here we go. And if you guys want to grab the paper, it's in the chat. You can always type !paper and it will pop back up. It will be in the show notes if you're watching this afterwards. Okay. Oh wait, is this like... No. Alright. Introduction. It is my critical evaluation that there is a largely overlooked fundamental flaw in Western epistemological foundation, which no doubt has origins that can be traced back further, but is reintroduced by the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Counter to the overwhelming ethos of the Enlightenment, this epistemological bedrock shockingly does not seem to be an epistemology of the human being, but only of the white human being. Indeed, I, as a Western scholar, have to relativize my epistemological heritage because it does not take into account the diversity of the human being. I have to carefully analyze the shortcomings of my epistemological traditions caused by a limited frame of reference that encompasses only the white and male human being. Additionally, I have to relativize my contemporary epistemological approach. I need to understand that I do not have any reason to consider Eurocentric epistemology superior. Eurocentric epistemological superiority is a purely arbitrary positioning. By reading some of the important so-called enlightened and enlightening philosophers, such as the exemplars Voltaire, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant, one can find blatant white supremacist racism. Consequently, it is very likely that their racism affected the construction of their philosophical edifices. However, it seems Western scholarship has demonstrated little interest to address this problem. It is not that the texts I engage here are hidden, at least then I could claim a conspiracy. Rather, they appear to be widely intentionally disregarded. If philosophy is to retain its integrity, then a work of amelioration must be done, and these disruptive fracturing epistemologies must be addressed. Yeah, people... I think I was just reading... I may have read something earlier about how basically Kant's racism is completely overlooked, but... I mean, a lot of... Yeah, alright, so let's see what this guy has to say. Okay, so maybe there's going to be a historical like romp here. Interesting. Fracturing Eurocentric Epistemologies. Voltaire. In Voltaire's philosophical dictionary, under the entry equality, it says, "Nothing can be clearer than that men enjoying the faculties of their common nature are in a state of equality. They are equal when they perform their animal functions and exercise their understandings." Voltaire recognizes that as a fundamental truth all humans are the same. However, he states that in the world as it is, this fundamental truth cannot become factual reality. If the earth were in fact what it might be supposed it should be, if men found it upon everywhere an easy and certain subsistence, and a climate congenial to their nature, it would be evidently impossible for one man to subjugate another. Let the globe be covered with wholesome fruits, let the air on which we depend for life convey us no disease and premature death. In the end, there will always be a significant class difference between the poor and the rich. It is impossible in our melancholy world to prevent men living in society from being divided into two classes, one of the rich who commands, the other of the poor who obey, and these two are subdivided into various others, which have also their respective shades of difference. Thus, after bemoaning how human equality cannot become factual reality because the world in which we live is not always equal, it is quite surprising to read Voltaire's study, The Negro, the following. In Voltaire's study of The Negro, the following. It may be said that if the Negro's understanding is not of a different nature from ours, it is at least greatly inferior. They are not capable of any great application or association, and seem formed neither in the advantages nor abuses of our philosophy. The petty nations of blacks, who have but little commerce with other nations, are strangers to all kinds of religious worship. The first degree of stupidity is to think only of the present and bodily wants. The second degree is to foresee by halves without being able to form any fixed society, to behold the stars with wonder and amazement, to celebrate certain feasts, to make general rejoicing on the return of certain seasons, or the appearance of a particular star, without going further or having any distinct positive idea. In this middle state between imbecility and infant reason, many nations have continued for several ages. This is an intellectual cabinet piece. Voltaire remains true to the premise that all human beings are alike and ideally should be equal, but the Negro's understanding is at least greatly inferior. This is a poorly concealed racism. Silently, Voltaire introduces another difference in addition to the class difference between poor and rich. This difference works in the same way as that of poor and rich. It divides people into two subclasses, and such a division does not deny that both subclasses belong to the class of human beings. However, in contrast to the difference between poverty and wealth, which cannot be prevented in our melancholy world, this other difference suddenly brings in an extremely vulgar way of normative difference into the matter. It can be said that this formulation is already extremely polemical. The mind of the Negro is like the Western mind, but whoever asserts this, whoever declares the Negro to be of the human kind, must at least agree that Negro's understanding is greatly inferior. The class difference came into the world because not all people can access the same resources. This does not break with the assumption that people are the same. This difference, however, exists because there is the Negro who, even when having access to resources, still does not know what to do. The Negro, in Voltaire's view, cannot simply become a human being in the actual sense. There is a considerable disparity between these two approaches to human beings. It is very strange that such a discrepancy can be found here with the work of one of the great precursors of the Enlightenment. Is this tension the isolated failing of one individual of the century of the Enlightenment? Yeah, so this looks like a I'm gonna get a bunch of rather uncomfortable quotes now from all of these famous people, but hey, this is history. This is what we had. It's gotta, as was it's if you don't live up to your history, it's the old doomed to repeat it anyway. So, David Hume. This hope must be given up immediately. On the contrary, this apparent tension, which obviously was not perceived as a tension, is not an isolated case at all. Let us listen to the deep reflections of Hume. All right, you're getting snarky now. Deep reflections of Hume, and an inquiry concerning human understanding. It is universally acknowledged that there is a great uniformity among the actions of men in all nations and ages, and that human nature remains the same in its principles and operations. The same motives always produce the same actions, the same events follow follow from the same causes: ambition, avarice, self-love, vanity, friendship, generosity, public spirit. These passions, mixed in various degrees and distributed through society, have been, from the beginning of the world, and still are, the source of all the actions and enterprises which have ever been observed among mankind. Would you know the sentiments, inclinations, and course of the life of Greeks and Romans? Study well the temper and actions of the French and English. You cannot be much mistaken transferring to the former most of the observations which you have made about the latter. Mankind are so much the same in all times and places that history informs us of nothing new or strange in this particular. Should a traveler returning from a far country bring us an account of men wholly different from any with whom we have ever acquainted, men who were entirely divested of avarice, ambition, or revenge, who knew no pleasure but friendship, generosity, and public spirit, we should immediately from these circumstances detect the falsehood and prove him a liar with the same certainty as if he had suffered his narration with stories of centaurs and dragons, miracles and prodigies. We have just learned that human nature remains still the same in its principles and operations. The French and English can easily be compared since they are both of the human kind. But then suddenly the same terrible intellectual trick Voltaire used can be found in a footnote in Hume's Unnational Characters. I am apt to suspect the Negroes, in general all the other species of men, for there are 4 or 5 different kinds. 4 or 5. I mean, what year was this? I don't remember. Okay, but I should think there'd be more than 4 or 5, but anyway. To be naturally inferior to the whites. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion other than white, nor even any individual eminent in either in action or speculation, no arts, no sciences. On the other hand, the most rude and barbarous of the whites, such as the ancient Germans, the present Tartars, have still something eminent about them in their valor, form of government, or some other particular. Such a uniform and constant difference could not happen in so many countries and ages if nature had not made an original distinction betwixt these breeds of men. Not to mention our colonies, there are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, of which none ever discovered any symptoms of ingenuity. The low people amongst us did distinguish themselves in every profession. In Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but 'tis likely he admired for very slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. Yeah. Thanks, Hume. Thus, all the humans are epistemologically equal, but then there is this strange species of men that does not do as the species Hume assigns himself to, and thus the species must be inferior, even naturally inferior to the whites. Hume wants to give a good reason why he thinks that, or does he just want to hide his racism? Why he thinks that, or does he just want to hide his racism? He claims the accomplishments of the whites cannot be found anywhere among the Negroes. Is that really a surprise? And if it is a surprise, why is that a bad thing? The answer seems to be that either the epistemology, political philosophy, or Hume's philosophy in total is just not a philosophy of the human. It is a philosophy of the white human. And this is, to a certain degree, justifiable. A philosopher has to think about a certain part of reality, but suddenly there is an implicit normative component introduced. Significantly, when he does not find comparable accomplishments in the Negro's culture to those in his culture, he concludes that they are inferior. Hume was right to point out that he did not find these accomplishments, but he was deeply wrong when the individual who indeed observed the is-ought gap, interpreted this finding as normatively relevant. Hume found a difference, that is all. The African political systems were different. That should not be a surprise. But a difference is in no way necessarily and implicitly a normative difference, and moreover, it is in no way a necessarily and implicitly normative difference in your favor. Nobody can deny that differences might be found, but at the same time, there is nothing that forces us to place two different things within a normative hierarchy. Frankly, I consider all absolute normative comparisons of thought systems, be they inferiorizing or superiorizing, as radically arbitrary. Hume does not understand that he looks to the African person and is disappointed that he does not find himself. There appears to be no attempt to see the other in their dignity. Inferiority is nowhere to be found here, just difference. But if Hume is implicitly biased, then that which is different from mine is at the same time inferior. Seems thus like Hume, like Voltaire, is part of the intellectual foundation of construction of thoughts that today is called white supremacy. Yeah. Yeah, is there anything interesting to say about this? I don't know. I mean, it does just seem sort of completely arbitrary, as the author says, like me good, you bad. Basically is it. I agree about the calling out the is-ought gap. Just is, but it doesn't mean it should ought be that way. Okay. Immanuel Kant. I mean, in some sense, let's give it one more try and hope something. I mean, you kind of showed your hand earlier. I don't think we're going to get very far, but yeah. So, but I mean, I'm not complaining about the writing. I just think it's sort of funny. It is entertaining. Let's give it one more try and hope an adequate understanding of the human being can be found in the most famous of all thinkers of the German Enlightenment. Kant states in his Anthropology from a pragmatic point of view. In order to assign the human being his class in the system of animate nature, nothing remains for us than to say that he has a character, which he himself creates insofar as he is capable of perfecting himself according to ends that he himself adopts. By means of this, the human being, as an animal endowed with the capacity of reason, rational animal, can make out of himself a rational animal. The capacity of reason, responsibil, then to animal rationale. Alright. Whereby he first preserves himself with his species, second, trains, instructs, and educates his species for domestic society, third, governs it as a systematic whole, arranged according to principles of reason, appropriate for society. But in comparison with the idea of possible rational beings on earth in general, the characteristic of the human species is this, that nature has planted in it the seed of discord, and has willed that its own reason brings concord out of this, or at least the constant approximation to it. Thus, this is what makes human a human. He has character which he himself creates. And this creation, as Kant just has taught us, goes a very specific way. But, disappointingly, Kant is not talking about all humans. He is, as we have to be aware of, only talking about humans in his debatable narrow sense. There are other inferior humans, Kant states in his Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime. The Negroes of Africa have by nature no feeling that rises about the trifling. Are these humans not capable of creating themselves? According to Kant, obviously not. Kant repeats Hume's foundational thought of white supremacy at length. Mr. Hume challenges anyone to cite a single example in which a Negro has shown talents, and asserts that among the hundreds of thousands of blacks who are transported elsewhere from their countries, although many of them have even been set free, not a single one was ever found presented anything great in art or science or any other praiseworthy quality, even though among the whites some continually rise aloft from the lowest rabble, and through superior gifts earn respect in the world. So fundamental is the difference between these two races of man, and it appears to be as great regarding mental capacities as in color. The religion of fetishes, so widespread among them, is perhaps a sort of idolatry that sinks as deep into the trifling as appears to be possible to human nature. A bird's feather, a cow's horn, a conch shell, or any other common object, so as it becomes consecrated by a few words, is an object of veneration and invocation in swearing oaths. The blacks are very vain, but in the Negro's way, and so talkative that they must be driven apart from each other with thrashings. Wow, I did not know this is exactly the one spot where Kant and Hume agree. That's amazing. Like, amazing and terrible, but still, like, it's just sort of gobsmackingly bad and amazing. So, yeah, kudos to the author for finding these exact quotes. I mean, I had not read this stuff myself, but I had heard that basically that these things existed. I had not, like, as the author said, had, you have, like, I knew it in the abstract that all these, there were racist passages in all these, authors, but, to read them is a certain sort of, it's entertaining in a very horrible way. It's like, watching a train wreck. It's like just going downhill. It's like, oh man, it's getting worse and worse. Okay, continuing. We learn that blacks do not have what it takes to be fully human, even after being set free, after being transported elsewhere from their countries, an appalling euphemism for slave trade, yes. They do not produce anything great, or should we say white. A great line from Wesley Snipes, and when he was with Rising Sun, when Sean Connery takes a bribe, basically, and Sean was criticizing him for doing something probably he shouldn't have done. And Wesley's like, well, what about you? You just took that like $100,000 gift. And he goes, well, I need this for my job. He goes, well, that makes it all white, doesn't it? I was like, that's a fantastic line. Okay, continuing. They do not have what it is needed to be fully human. Kant is suggesting that there is an essential and natural gift that those who are white inherently have and those who are black inherently lack. The consequence of this is simply that the Enlightenment is not about black people. In his famous essay on an answer to the question, what is enlightenment, Kant writes, enlightenment is mankind's exit from its self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to make use of one's own understanding without the guidance of another. Self-incurred is this inability if its cause lies not in the lack of understanding, but rather in the lack of the resolution and the courage to use it without the guidance of another. Some other words. Have the courage to use your own understanding is thus the motto of enlightenment. Yes, they raised up rationality. After we have learned about the inferiority of the blacks' mental capacities, we have to understand that the motto of the Enlightenment is not directed at humanity, it is directed at Europe, or more specifically at male Europe. For Kant, European humanity is the humanity par excellence. In the midst of Kant's work, we find foundations of the most vulgar, elitist white supremacy. Humanity is in its greatest perfection in the race of whites. The yellow Indians are already of lower talent. The Negroes are much lower, and at the lowest there are parts of the American people. Oh wow, thanks Kant. I mean, I guess maybe he was talking about the first peoples here in the Americas, like our Native Americans. So he really didn't like them, and I suppose the yellow Indians might have be referring to people from like Southeast Asia. Okay. All of this is disturbing, very disturbing. The triptych of Enlightenment philosophers Voltaire, Hume, and Kant speak with the attitude of addressing all human beings. However, this is not the case. Take a look at the humans they do talk to. Only the so-called white humans can be found, and to make it worse, not even all of them, for they are certainly not talking to women, to homosexual persons, etc. In other words, these philosophers are talking only to actual humans, to humans that matter, to humans of value. We find all of this at the very heart of the Enlightenment. All these approaches pretend to be descriptive, but they are not. I would argue that the European intellectual elite described itself, roamed around in the world, did not find itself again, and thus judged nobody as like exactly, and because of that, like us exactly, and because of that, and here comes the sheer arbitrary positioning, they're the only ones that matter. This European narcissism was not looking for the world as the world, it was looking for itself and looking down on everything else. It was mostly interested in replicating itself, and this came to actual reality with colonialism. Edward Said described that with haunting precision. You get rid of the most offending human and animal blight, and you can find the rest to reservations, compounds, native homeland, and you can build a now society on the vacated space. This was Europe reconstituted abroad, its multiplication of space successfully projected and managed. The result was a widely varied group of little Europes scattered throughout Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Can white supremacists be enlightened? I must come to a very strange conclusion. The underlying anthropologies of Voltaire, Hume, and Kant are not actually anthropologies. They are only logoi, teachings about the anthropos, the human being, insofar as this anthropos is leukos, a white human being. Instead of anthropologies, I find normative leukologies, more precisely even leuco-androheterologies. This must be of importance, for if these thinkers held the non-white human in such contempt, I must question if the humanity of non-white human reflected in their work. Despite the forays undertook by some researchers, the question, did these thinkers of the Enlightenment cover the reality of the non-white human at all, remains an issue of central importance requiring further broad philosophical consideration of works past and future attitudinal approaches of white scholarship. More polemically, is the critique of pure reason may be only a critique of pure white male reason. Is it possible to be a white supremacist and, at the same time, properly write a critique of pure reason? Would being a white supremacist not imply some significant limitation in the scope of thinking? How can one think about the reason for the human being in general if one ignores all non-white, non-male reason? Can you speak of an inferior race and develop a categorical imperative at the same time? Does not one influence the other? Can one be a white supremacist and still bring forth the Enlightenment? Okay, so we've got actually, this is one of the things, this bit right here, I guess. Here's a bit of an issue. Now, there's a lot of like arguments, of course, that say a lot of nonsense, really, but a lot of arguments saying, look, this is not a legit form of argumentation. This is an ad hominem attack. Now, does what they write, does their personal opinion as basically a white supremacist pull down their other writings? And is this just a personal attack when it's not? Now, this might be one of the cases where, look, they had I think accusing them of white supremacy is actually an ad hominem, but it's not a fallacy. If you don't know what it is to be human, then you can't write for what it is to be a human. But that is a personal attack on their understanding of what it is to be a person. But that is the whole point. If you're going to attack the ad hominem, that's because they were a bad person. They don't know what it is to be a good person. They can't write for all the people. They can't even write for any of the people. They can only write for crappy people like themselves. I'm not saying they were crappy people, but they're only writing for the white supremacist version of things. So this is an interesting bit of argument. This is basically what I would consider a legit ad hominem attack. If you're going to attack someone in an ad hominem way that isn't always a fallacy, this is actually a good use of ad hominem, and I think most other fallacies have these exceptions too, but they're very weird when you find them. And this is one of these things I think we had weasel words and stuff I was talking about the other day with the reasonableness. This is how you hide when you're being a crappy person. You say, oh, you're making a fallacy. No, they might not be making a fallacy. They may have you dead to rights, but they're not arguing in the way you like. But you're being you're gatekeeping. You're saying, well, you're arguing in the wrong way, and so I can ignore your argument. But I think this is the right sort of non-fallacy use of ad hominem. So it's just a very interesting. This is one of the reasons why this argument doesn't get made. I think it scares people to argue in this way. So there's a very interesting sort of argumentation here. So, okay, continuing. I do not know the answers to these questions, and I am embarrassed not to know the answers, and thus to admit that I did not take this into account in my very own prior philosophical work. I am embarrassed that, as far as I can see, these questions are not broadly discussed, and even worse, there does not even seem to be a consent that these questions are important at all. Personally, I think this is a scandalous failure of modern Western philosophy. This needs to be changed. Yeah, this is exactly part and parcel of what the issue is here, that they don't the questions are important at all. So these questions are important, I think, are in some sense discounted by the style of argumentation you need to make, but that in this case, the ad hominem attack really cuts deep. It's not a fallacy. So why do people ignore it? It's because they've been taught the wrong way, that the ad hominem in this case is really not the way to argue, but in this instance, it is the way to argue. They were bad people, and if you're a bad person, you don't know what it is to be a good person. And if your reasoning only pertains to yourself and like your little in-clique group, as in the white European, then you can't talk about everyone else's reasoning. Okay, continuing. Just to be clear, this is not about throwing away the work our sampling of the renowned Western thinkers Voltaire, Hume, Kant, and so many others. I have not even mentioned Hegel or Fichte. Without a doubt, these works will remain to be of great value, but they need to be contextualized. We must be vigilant about deconstructing the nature of truth and reality upon which epistemologies are based. I need to be aware of the fact that these people were white supremacists, and thus had a significantly narrowed perception of what is human and what is not. Consequently, if a philosopher has narrowed perception of the human being while at the same time working on freeing the human being out of self-incurred immaturity, it would be quite surprising if that would not have had significantly affected that person's philosophy. I need to be aware of the fact that the history of white supremacy runs right through the history of philosophy of the Enlightenment. Of course, this is not a secret. None of the texts I cited are concealed. This problem is hidden in plain sight indeed. Most Western philosophers, I assume, know all this. They know, but only rarely someone uses this knowledge and addresses these tensions. Whatever the answers will be to the questions I've raised, the first order of action is undoubtedly to explicitly acknowledge the disturbing double standards in these most influential philosophers beyond lip service. This acknowledgement needs to transform the scholarly attitudes in tangible ways beyond a cursory mention of the white supremacy of Voltaire or Hume or Kant to a meaningful analysis of their white supremacy and how that affected their thinking and ours. Yeah, well, it's very hard when you're brought up in this tradition to then escape the tradition. You have to do a lot of work to get out of it, and then you can go back and then see what it did to you. But I think that's anything, basically, when you're brought up in a certain way, then to go think differently is, it takes just same amount of time to go learn one thing, then go learn another thing, and then compare and contrast. But you have to learn two ways at that point. So it's very hard, and that is, I think, one of the difficulties here, that it's hard enough to learn any one of these philosophies, and then to learn another one to get out of it. So, question is, how do we understand, same time we're freeing him to have his self-incurred immaturity. Good sentence right here. So, there we go. Okay, what's footnote 28? I don't see it right here. Was it up here? No. Alright, so maybe I'll find that later. The total disregard for African thought. Continuing. It is thus somewhat more understandable why the distinguished moral philosophy was not able to stop at imperialist exploitation of Africa and so many other parts in the world. It is evident that there was simply nothing of the actual human value in the colonies until the Europeans brought themselves there. If this seems inflammatory, let us... Oh yeah, and if anybody has questions, please let me know. If this seems inflammatory, let us once again use Said's words instead. The human and animal blight was eliminated and Europe could replicate itself. This has a strange implication. African philosophical thought has not been colonized in a strict sense. In contrast to the exploitation of labor or land, philosophy or African thought in general has markedly not been exploited. It can perhaps now be understood why. It has been regarded with such contempt that it was not recognized as original thought or true philosophy at all, but as something so inferior that it was not deemed worth exploiting. This originated with the white supremacist philosophy of the Enlightenment and can still be seen in the more recent reviews of African thought, as they might have begun with Placid Temple's book, Bantu Philosophy. African thought is still characterized here, if it is accepted as thinking at all, as inferior, primitive thinking that, while fascinatingly exotic, has nothing too serious to offer. At the same time that African thought was deeply disregarded, Western thought was introduced to Africa. However, it could not be received and processed in a positive sense. It was forced into African thinking in an attempt to gain credibility as actual philosophy in the first place. Eurocentric philosophy committed practically an epistemicide on African thought. Alright, very cute. Epistemicide. This has continued to the present day through, for example, the higher education institutional cultures who continue to privilege Western symbols, rituals, and behaviors imposed as a result of epistemicide. Epistemological racism is still very much alive and continues as the white... maybe this is a big term, I have no idea. Sorry, if it is, I'm ignorant of that term. Epistemological racism is still very much alive and continues as the white supremacist heritage of the Enlightenment still permeates the education of successive generations of scholars. And how could this epistemological racism not still reign? We have just seen it. Philosophers of the highest caliber were vulgar white supremacists, and this white supremacy in its explicit and in implicit form was forced into African thought, especially into the academic curricula. Thus, African thought, following Fanlin's line of reasoning, largely failed to develop under colonial oppression without constantly seeing itself as primitive and inferior. I wanted to check the footnote 28, which is right here. Big footnote. Alright, okay, I'm continuing. African thinking in the shadow of colonialism is only perceived as serious thought if it overcame its so-called African primitivisms and thus turns into Western thinking. The colonial Western narcissism again reproduces itself, this time in the realm of philosophy. It must thus be the task of contemporary Western philosophy to finally approach African thought as in a non-contemptible manner to overcome our implicit racism. It seems to me urgent the urgent task of Western thinkers is to seek a means to engage with African thought in a manner that exposes and finally overcomes this racist contempt. Western thinking will not be able to enter into meaningful discourse with African thought if it does not overcome its colonial contempt. Western thinking must strive to understand the colonial and post-colonial assault on African thought thoroughly. We Western thinkers must de-superiorize ourselves, our philosophy, and our thinking. De-superiorization, the practical decolonization from the standpoint of the violator, must be the project that flanks the African work on decolonization. Yeah, don't know how to... See, the problem is dismantling your own knowledge is very difficult. As I was saying before, to learn more than one way of doing thinking is hard. So it's like, this is a lot of work. I mean, that's probably why it doesn't get done, but yeah. Like, I just was trying to think of suggestions about what to start on to think about how to do a different epistemology. I guess it's like, you don't want to be like, well, African people, tell us what your epistemology. I mean, that's terrible. So, let's see. Try to think about some. Continuing. Philosophy as a human matter. Western thinking can and must give up its strange pretension to what constitutes true philosophy and finally embrace it as a humane, elemental, universal practice. We have to overcome the assumptions that anybody has a prerogative on philosophy. Where there is a problem, a dilemma, a crisis, there is philosophy. Philosophy, who could dare to doubt that seriously, is a humane matter. This includes finally affirming non-Eurocentric philosophy and overcoming the white supremacy of the West's philosophical tradition. I should indeed all of us Western scholars should revise this heritage to be inclusive of all mankind. We need to overcome the implicit racism that we carry around with us to this very day. Our epistemology should no longer fracture our and other epistemologies. Only then will Western thought be able to present itself as a worthy discourse partner to engage African thought and its practitioners. The Western philosophers need to consider their very own historical epistemic stance. Philosophizing Eurocentrically in this day and age seems to me not only disturbingly reductionistic, it is anti-philosophical. Every philosopher educated in the Western tradition knows of the incorporated fundamental racial bias in so many philosophers, and yet we do not know how this affects our current philosophy. We Western scholars do not know this because it is unknowable. You see, I don't know about this unknowable right here. It's in some sense, it's difficult to know. I wouldn't go with unknowable. All right. Continuing. We do not know because we were ignorant and had not heeded the words of our African colleague, such as Molefi Asante, who warned that every subject in the curriculum of the Eurocentric university is permeated with white supremacy. A student completes the curriculum to his or her psychological peril. Yes, that's true. We have also ignored working in the West colleagues who pointed at these problems, such as the critique found in Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro, published 80 years ago. All this is just embarrassing. I wonder if there's this other thing. It's like I was saying, the ad hominem attack that the author here leveled correctly at the Voltaire, Hume, and Kant. I wonder if that scales up to the society level. People are avoiding this sort of thing while you're saying, well, you're attacking the society, and that is illegitimate. You have to get some sort of other argument. Perhaps not. Perhaps there is some sort of, not ad hominem, like at the person, but like at the social fabric, is a sort of underlying this sort of decolonialization arguments. But I'd have to think more about that. Continuing. Eurocentric philosophers need to be more critical in handling the Euro-Western traditions. Western scholars need to begin decolonization with the de-superiorization and de-Eurocentrification of Western academic education, for as Mule, apologize how you said the name, suggests transformation of higher education generally requires a professorate with a decolonial posture. I fully recommend a relational and ethical approach to epistemological issues and a responsive decolonial pedagogy based on care. It is of the greatest importance to understand this pedagogy is not, as Western thought so often tries to claim, an objective matter. It is highly contextualized and individualistically ethical matter. It must be acknowledged that the educator is allowed to make his personal epistemological choices, where that knowledge is socially constructed and situated within and between knowers. With this relational epistemological outlook, it needs to be understood that the different opinions about reality will exist. The educator cannot be asked to believe anything and everything. They cannot have a view from anywhere and a view from everywhere. We have to turn this epistemological problem around when it comes to these issues of difference and understand it as an ethical problem. The question is not who is right about reality and how that should be taught, but rather, how can I take the next human being seriously in their approach to reality? Eurocentric philosophers need to decenter their approach. We need to relativize our Eurocentric philosophical posture, develop and maintain a desuperiorizing outlook, and embrace a pedagogical praxis that acknowledges the practitioner's positionality. Through these reflexive practices that embrace conscientization and sensitivity, we hope that culturally responsive pedagogies can be promoted that will form the basis of democratic learning communities that are inclusive and open to revision as the process of decolonization evolves. Conclusion. A few glimpses into the history of the Enlightenment philosophy through the lens of Voltaire, Kant, and Hume were enough to conclude that the legacy of the Enlightenment is at times a liability. Western philosophers must finally acknowledge this burden. It is unclear how deep the racism of Enlightenment has deformed philosophy, and to what extent we still, willingly or not, continue to protect this racism because an extensive critical reflection has still not become widely accepted. Western philosophers must directly address this unexplained danger instead of treating it as historical marginalia. This should begin immediately through critical reflection, pedagogical and curricular choices in the education of the next generation of philosophers, our research agendas, and our ethical practices. There is no reason to wait any longer. Let us get started. Okay. So that was a little bit of a history and, like I said, an interesting argument because it's you don't normally see these. I think, as I said, you don't normally see this sort of attack because people don't like this sort of attack, even if it is entirely justified. It's like someone once said, why would anyone want to read Heideggerian ethics? I mean, granted, Heidegger didn't say much on ethics. Maybe there was good reason for that, but why would anyone want to read something from a guy who was... there's no question he was a Nazi, and how crappy was he in a personal life, I don't know, but like apparently he wasn't like that bad to the people who knew him. But it's like, why would you want to like read the ethics of somebody who was just willing to just send lots of people to their death? It'd be weird. Not even weird, it'd just be like the wrong thing to do. Weird's the wrong word there. So anything else to say? So like I said, I appreciate having all these like terrible quotes from the philosophers all together. That was interesting to read, a little bit of fun. I do worry sometimes that like I'm going to say something and it's going to be taken massively out of context while reading one of these papers, but just the danger of reading things out loud, that is. So I do wonder if, again, like once you move from the attack on the particular philosophers and you're moving to the whole anthropology and sociology of philosophy, and how does this attack actually scale up? That is a more difficult question, and as the author stated, they don't know how pervasive the problem is. So exactly how, like even how that works is, I'm not sure how that works at all. So from one sort of racist statement or even racist philosophy, how does it scale up? Because like I mentioned with the case of Heidegger, I mean, you can read his metaphysics, there's no ethics there, and I don't think you can really it'd be hard to get from his metaphysics to like politics or political things. Not that it is impossible, I'm just saying it's not like a completely obvious how these things go. So I mean, maybe the whole fact that there is no ethics in it may be an indication of that, but a lot of people, like, they stick to their area, and that's fine. It's like, why, if I'm an epistemologist, why should I go start writing ethics now? Not that you shouldn't have a broad understanding of things, though. Alright, does the chat have any questions about this, or for me about this? I think I don't have a whole lot more to say. I had one more idea, but I don't remember what it was right now. Yeah, scaling up is always a hard problem. How do you go from the ad hominem to the like sociology against like the group of like the history of philosophy, or the contemporary understanding of philosophy, and sort of identify what has gone wrong in it, and how to fix that? Because like we said, I was reading this morning. I mean, it's once you start trying to pull apart the biases, you get in sort of like either it's too big or too small. You get like a skepticism that you don't it becomes too skeptical. You're worried about everything going wrong, and then you don't know where to start. So that's also the issue. So how do we actually go from these interesting sort of parts of these philosophies of like Hume or Kant or Voltaire, and then show how that does permeate the rest of philosophy? So that's a difficult issue, because people don't like admitting that they are pulling on racist or white supremacist philosophy. Okay, but that's it for now. I guess I'll be back tomorrow with another paper or something else. We'll find out. Have a good night, everyone, and stay safe out there, and go watch the Dave Chappelle little video he just put out. Bye-bye.